Picture this. You have just finished preparing a meal. You have touched raw meat, handled vegetables pulled from soil, probably picked something up off the floor and put it back on the counter because nobody was watching. And now you are about to eat. Before you do any of that, you walk to the sink, turn on the tap, pump some soap, scrub for a full 20 seconds while internally humming a song to keep time, rinse, and dry your hands on a clean towel. You do this without thinking. It takes 12 seconds of conscious attention, and the rest is pure muscle memory installed so early in childhood that you cannot remember learning it. You do it because you were told germs exist, that they transfer from surface to surface, that they cause illness, and that soap disrupts the lipid membrane of certain pathogens in ways that water alone cannot. You absorbed this information from parents and teachers and public health campaigns before you were old enough to critically evaluate any of it, and now it is simply part of who you are. The story of ancient hand washing is longer, stranger, and more sophisticated than most people expect. And it begins not with soap or science, but with something far older and far more human: the observation that certain behaviors seemed to make people less likely to die. Start with the basic problem that ancient humans were navigating, because it frames everything that follows. Human hands are extraordinarily effective at transferring biological material from one surface to another. Every time you touch something, you deposit some of what is on your hands onto that surface, and you pick up some of what is on that surface onto your hands. This exchange happens constantly and invisibly, and in environments without running water or soap or any understanding of microbiology, the accumulation of pathogens on hands and their subsequent transfer to food, mouth, and eyes represented one of the most significant routes of infectious disease transmission in human history. Fecal-oral transmission, which is the clinical term for what happens when material from human or animal waste makes its way into the digestive system, was responsible for an enormous proportion of ancient human mortality. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, hepatitis A, various parasitic infections, rotavirus, and a long list of other diseases travel this route. In communities without sanitation infrastructure, without understanding of pathogen transmission, and without hand-washing practices, these diseases moved through populations with devastating efficiency. The question of whether ancient humans washed their hands cannot be separated from the broader question of what ancient hygiene looked like generally, because hand-washing as a practice does not exist in isolation. It exists within a wider framework of how a given culture or population understood the relationship between cleanliness, ritual, health, and social order. And that framework varied enormously across time and place in ways that produce a picture considerably more nuanced than a simple yes or no. Here is the thing about early humans. The hunter-gatherers of the Paleolithic and Mesolithic periods living before settled agriculture and permanent structures. Their hygiene situation was complicated by factors that cut in multiple directions simultaneously. On one hand, mobile hunter-gatherer groups were not living in the conditions of concentrated waste and contamination that made disease transmission so catastrophic in later settled populations. When a group of 20 or 30 people moves through a landscape, defecates away from their food and water sources as most animals instinctively do, and does not remain in the same location long enough for waste to accumulate and contaminate water supplies, the fecal-oral transmission route is naturally disrupted. The disease burden from fecal-oral pathogens in mobile populations is substantially lower than in settled ones, simply because the conditions for their transmission are less efficiently maintained. This does not mean early hunter-gatherers did not get sick. They did. Parasitic infections in particular were common, and zoonotic diseases, infections that transfer from animals to humans, were an ongoing hazard for people who hunted, processed, and ate wild animals regularly. But the specific disease pattern of settled populations, the waterborne illness outbreaks, the epidemic spread through contaminated communal water sources, the density-dependent disease transmission that required large, concentrated populations, was less characteristic of mobile groups. On the other hand, early humans lived in intimate contact with animal carcasses, blood, soil, plant material, and each other in ways that created abundant opportunities for pathogen transfer. Processing a large animal kill involves extended contact with internal organs, blood, and biological material that carries significant pathogen load. Without any mechanism for cleaning hands after this kind of work, the transfer of that material to food and to other group members was inevitable. What did early humans do about this? The honest answer is that direct evidence from this period is almost non-existent. Stone tools survive, bones survive. Direct evidence of hygiene practices does not survive in the archaeological record from this far back because the materials and behaviors involved leave no lasting trace. What we can do is reason from indirect evidence. From what we know about primate behavior, from analogy with contemporary hunter-gatherer groups, and from the much richer evidence that begins to appear when settled, civilizations start leaving written and physical records. Great apes, our closest living relatives, do engage in cleaning behaviors that are relevant here. Chimpanzees have been observed wiping their hands on leaves after handling food or biological material. They use leaves to clean themselves after defecation. They pick debris from their own bodies and from each other through grooming, which serves both social bonding functions and practical cleaning functions. These behaviors are not trivial. They represent a behavioral orientation toward removing biological material from the body that predates our species and was almost certainly present in our hominin ancestors as well. Leaf wiping and grass wiping of hands after contact with blood, soil, or organic material is a behavior that costs almost nothing in terms of effort and provides observable, if not understood, benefits in terms of reducing irritation, contamination, and the attraction of insects. It requires no soap, no water, no understanding of pathogens, and no cultural instruction beyond basic imitation of others in the group doing the same thing. It is the kind of behavior that natural selection could reinforce simply through the benefits it provides, long before any conscious hygiene framework existed. Whether early Homo sapiens engaged in these kinds of simple cleaning behaviors is not something we can directly confirm from the archaeological record. But given that our primate relatives do them, given that they are low-cost and observable benefit behaviors, and given that all contemporary hunter-gatherer groups studied anthropologically engage in some forms of body cleaning, the inference that our ancient ancestors also engaged in basic hand and body cleaning seems reasonable. The leap from instinctive wiping behavior to deliberate hand-washing as a practiced response to a perceived need, however, is a much larger step, and it is one that the archaeological and textual record can actually begin to trace as we move forward in time. The first clear documented evidence for intentional hand-cleaning practices comes from early settled civilizations, and it arrives entangled with something that might initially seem unrelated: religion. Across ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and later the Greco-Roman world, ritual purification of the hands appears in religious and ceremonial contexts before it appears in anything resembling a public health framework. The act of cleaning hands before approaching the sacred, before ritual meals, before prayer, before contact with certain objects or persons, is one of the most widespread and independently recurring practices in ancient religious tradition. In ancient Mesopotamia, cuneiform tablets from Sumerian and Babylonian civilizations include instructions for ritual hand cleaning before religious ceremonies. Priests and worshippers were expected to clean their hands before approaching temple altars or handling sacred objects. This was understood in terms of spiritual purity, the removal of ritual contamination or impurity that came from contact with the profane world, not in terms of pathogen reduction. Ancient Egyptian religious practice similarly involved ritual hand-washing, particularly for priests, before sacred activities. The elaborate purity requirements for Egyptian priests described in surviving texts include repeated washing of hands and body as preparation for contact with the divine. The ancient Vedic traditions of India, preserved in texts including the Rig Veda and subsequent literature, contain extensive instructions regarding hand washing before meals, after using the toilet, after contact with the deceased, and in numerous other specified contexts. The Vedic framework for these practices was spiritual and social. Clean hands were part of the ritual and social order required for proper conduct of life and religious observance. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. None of these ancient traditions articulated a germ theory. None of them understood that bacteria and viruses existed, or that they transferred from contaminated surfaces to hands, to food, to mouths. The framework was entirely different. Impurity, ritual contamination, divine requirement, social propriety. But the behavior they produced, cleaning hands with water, before eating and after contact with waste or the dead, happened to be the right behavior for the right outcome, even if the explanation for why was completely wrong by modern standards. This is one of the most interesting patterns in the history of medicine and public health, the discovery of beneficial practices through cultural and religious frameworks that preceded any understanding of the underlying mechanism by thousands of years. The ancient Hebrew tradition preserved in the Torah and later developed in the Talmud provides one of the most detailed early codifications of hand-washing practice in the ancient world. The requirement to wash hands before eating bread, known as netalat yadayim, is a ritual obligation in Jewish law with extensive specifications. Water must be poured over the hands from a vessel, covering the hands to the wrist, and the washing is accompanied by a blessing. The Talmud records extensive rabbinic discussion about the precise requirements, the minimum amount of water needed, what vessels are acceptable, and the circumstances under which the obligation applies. The justification given in rabbinic literature for this practice is ritual purity rather than hygiene in the modern sense. The hands are described as potentially having contracted ritual impurity through contact with various substances or situations, and the washing removes that impurity before contact with food. The framework is entirely religious and legal, not medical. But the public health effect of this practice, consistently followed by a population across generations, was significant. Regular hand washing before eating substantially reduces fecal oral pathogen transmission, regardless of whether the person washing understands why. The ancient Israelite communities that followed these laws would have experienced lower rates of certain foodborne illnesses than comparable communities without such practices. Not because the religious framework was medically informed, but because the behavior it produced happened to intersect with what we now know prevents disease transmission. This pattern, ritual or religious practice accidentally producing genuine public health benefit, repeats across multiple ancient traditions and represents one of the ways that culturally accumulated behavioral rules can incorporate beneficial practices before any scientific understanding of those practices exists. Ancient Rome provides an interesting case study in the relationship between hygiene infrastructure and hand-washing practice. Because Rome developed public water infrastructure of extraordinary scale and sophistication and the behavioral practices that accompanied it. Roman cities were served by aqueducts that brought water from distant sources into urban centers with engineering precision that was not matched in Europe until the 19th century. Roman public baths, the thermae and balnea, were centers of social life that served large portions of the urban population and involved extensive washing of the body. Public fountains throughout Roman cities provided water access to people who did not have private water connections. Wealthy Roman homes had running water piped directly into kitchens and washing areas. In this infrastructure-rich environment, hand washing was accessible in ways it simply was not in many other ancient contexts. Roman writers documented washing hands before meals as a social expectation among the educated and prosperous. Martial, Horace, and other Roman writers reference hand-washing in contexts that suggest it was a marker of social refinement and proper conduct, though again the framework is social propriety rather than disease prevention. Romans used several substances for cleaning beyond water alone. Soda ash, urine, and various alkaline substances were used as cleaning agents. Urine, particularly aged urine, contains ammonia, and was used across the ancient world as a cleaning agent for both textiles and skin because of its ability to cut through grease. The Romans were sophisticated enough about chemistry in a practical sense to identify and use substances that enhanced the cleaning power of water, even without any theoretical framework for why they worked. The Roman public bath culture did, however, create its own hygiene problems that illustrate the limits of ancient understanding. The communal bathing pools, particularly the caldarium hot pools, were not regularly drained and replaced in ways that would prevent pathogen accumulation. The warm, communal water that everyone shared was an efficient transmission route for skin infections and other conditions. The Romans created one of the most sophisticated water infrastructure systems in the ancient world and simultaneously created some optimal conditions for certain kinds of disease transmission. Because their understanding of how disease spread was based on miasma theory, the idea that disease came from bad air and odors rather than on any concept of pathogen transmission through contaminated water. The ancient Chinese medical and philosophical tradition developed hygiene practices with a different underlying logic but similarly sophisticated outcomes in specific areas. Traditional Chinese medicine understood health in terms of balance between opposing forces and the proper flow of vital energy, and cleanliness practices were embedded within this framework as maintenance of proper bodily and environmental order. Han Dynasty texts describe washing hands before food preparation and consumption, cleaning of wounds to remove contaminating material, and various ablution practices connected to both daily routine and ceremonial requirements. The Chinese tradition of washing hands and face upon waking as a daily practice appears in historical records from early in the imperial period and reflects a cultural embedding of cleaning behavior in daily routine that would have produced regular hand cleaning regardless of any specific disease theory. The Chinese also developed sophisticated soap-like substances from relatively early in their history. Substances made from plant materials, including saponin containing plants like soapwort and various tree nuts, were used as cleansing agents that enhanced the cleaning effect of water by surfactant action, the same basic mechanism by which modern soap works. The practical discovery that certain plant substances helped remove grease and biological material from skin predated any understanding of why by a very long time. Ancient India's Ayurvedic medical tradition, one of the oldest continuously practiced medical systems in the world, contains some of the most explicit ancient discussion of hand hygiene in a context that approaches the medical rather than being purely ritual. Ayurvedic texts specify washing hands before food preparation, before eating, after using the toilet, after contact with blood or waste, after touching animals, and after contact with the sick or dead. The reasoning given in Ayurvedic texts is connected to concepts of impurity and balance in the body's doshas, rather than to germ theory. But the behavioral specifications map closely onto what modern public health would recommend for preventing fecal-oral transmission. The Karaka Samhita, one of the foundational Ayurvedic texts, contains instructions for physicians on the importance of clean hands when examining patients and preparing medicines. Recommendations that have obvious practical benefit in preventing the transfer of pathogens between patients, even though the theoretical framework supporting them was entirely pre-microbial. Ancient Indian civilization also developed some of the earliest documented forms of soap-like preparations. Preparations made from plant ash, specific plant materials with natural saponin content, and various organic materials were used for cleaning the body and hands in ways that went beyond simple water washing. The practical chemistry of ancient Indian cleaning preparations was sophisticated enough to have real cleaning efficacy even before anyone understood the molecular basis of how surfactants worked. The single most important moment in the modern history of hand washing deserves its own section, because it is one of the most extraordinary and tragic stories in the history of medicine. In the 1840s, a Hungarian physician named Ignaz Semmelweis was working in the Vienna General Hospital's maternity wards and noticed something deeply troubling in his data. The ward staffed by medical students and physicians had a dramatically higher rate of puerperal fever, childbed fever, than the ward staffed by midwives. Women were dying at rates that should have been alarming by any standard, and they were dying specifically in the doctor-attended ward. Semmelweis investigated and developed a hypothesis. The medical students and physicians were coming directly from performing autopsies on cadavers to delivering babies, without cleaning their hands between these activities. They were, in the framework we now understand, transferring pathogenic material directly from corpses into the bodies of women in labor. The midwives did not perform autopsies. Their hands were not carrying cadaverous material. Semmelweis introduced mandatory hand washing with chlorinated lime solution between autopsy work and patient care. The mortality rate in the doctor-attended ward dropped dramatically to levels comparable with the midwife ward. He had found a simple, cheap, effective intervention that saved lives immediately and demonstrably. The medical establishment largely rejected him. His findings contradicted the prevailing miasma theory of disease and implied that physicians themselves were causing the deaths of their patients, which was an implication that the profession found deeply offensive and refused to accept. Semmelweis was eventually dismissed from his position, struggled professionally, and died in a mental institution in 1865 at the age of 47, just a few years before Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister established germ theory in ways that would have completely vindicated his observations. The story of Semmelweis is frequently cited as an example of how institutional resistance to uncomfortable evidence can cost lives, and it is that. But it also illustrates something important about the entire history of hand-washing. The practice's benefits were observable long before its mechanism was understood, and the failure to act on observable benefit in the absence of theoretical explanation has consequences measured in human lives. Germ theory, established through the work of Pasteur and Koch in the 1860s and 1870s, and Joseph Lister's subsequent development of antiseptic surgical technique, provided the first scientific framework for understanding why hand-washing prevented disease. For the first time, the beneficial behavior and the explanatory mechanism were aligned. Once germ theory was established and accepted, the public health argument for hand-washing became theoretically grounded in a way that allowed it to be systematically promoted and implemented. The translation of germ theory into public health policy took additional decades. Florence Nightingale's influence on nursing hygiene practices in the context of the Crimean War dramatically demonstrated the mortality benefits of clean hands and clean environments in clinical settings. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, hand-washing with soap was being promoted as a public health measure in ways that gradually embedded it in the behavioral repertoire of populations in industrialized countries. The soap industry expanded dramatically through the 19th century, moving from a product available primarily to the wealthy to a mass-market commodity promoted with health messaging that tied soap use to disease prevention and social respectability simultaneously. The marketing of soap in the late 19th and early 20th centuries intertwined public health messaging with commercial interest in ways that were not always pure in motivation, but did produce widespread adoption of a beneficial practice. The full arc of this story, from primate leaf wiping to Semmelweis to modern hand hygiene protocol, reveals something important about how human behavior and human understanding relate to each other. For most of human history, the right behavior, cleaning hands before eating and after contact with waste and the dead, was practiced in many cultures through frameworks that had nothing to do with microbiology. Religious obligation, ritual purity, social propriety, and cultural tradition all produced hand-washing behavior in populations whose theoretical understanding of why it helped was entirely disconnected from the actual mechanism. This means that millions of people across thousands of years were protecting themselves from fecal-oral pathogen transmission through rules they followed for completely different reasons. The protection was real, the explanation was wrong, and the protection happened anyway. It also means that the absence of hand-washing in other populations or contexts was not stupidity or ignorance in any meaningful sense. It was the absence of either the theoretical understanding that would make the behavior obviously necessary, or the cultural framework that happened to produce the behavior for other reasons. Populations that developed neither germ theory nor ritual hand-washing requirements were not less intelligent than those who did. They were missing a specific piece of cultural or intellectual development that happened to align with public health benefit. The modern hand hygiene framework, the 20-second soap scrub with attention to specific areas that public health campaigns have refined over decades, is the culmination of a process that began with primates wiping their hands on leaves, continued through thousands of years of ritual hand-washing practices whose true function was invisible to their practitioners, and achieved its current form only after the microbiological revolution of the 19th century provided the explanatory framework that everything else had been building toward without knowing it. Ancient humans washed their hands. Some of them did, some of the time, for reasons that had nothing to do with the reasons we now know matter. They were right about the behavior. They were entirely wrong about why. And the gap between those two things is a window into something profound about how human knowledge accumulates. Through observation and imitation and cultural transmission and lucky accident, working toward the right answer by paths that would not have looked like progress to anyone walking them at the time. Which honestly is not entirely different from how most human progress works.